Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's never easy to talk post-lunch. I know you probably know. I hope your lunch was good. But I have great pleasure in calling Rohan Murty up on stage. Rohan, if you'll please join me. Rohan told me a very interesting story, and I thought that I'd get straight to it to introduce him best. He said, recently I read up that he's a junior fellow in the Harvard Society of Fellows, and he said there was one gentleman 50 years ago who was the only computer engineer who was one of the fellows, and I'm the only one after that. There has been one more, but ladies and gentlemen, this is the youngest and only Indian computer engineer in the Harvard Society of Fellows. I think that deserves a round of applause. Rohan is also, Rohan, you're a proud Bangalorean? Rohan is a proud Bangalorean. He's a cotton student, so any Bangalore people out there would. And Rohan is somebody who is now running the Murty Classical Library of India, which I think is a bit of a passion project for him. And what they're trying to do is something that Rohan will possibly talk about a little bit. Yeah. So they're trying to take ancient Indian languages and books in those ancient languages and very indigenously turn them into English in a way that is true to its style. And I think that's a fabulous thing. And here to talk about the relevance of ancient Indian literature and its significance and why we need a little more of it in our curriculum. Ladies and gentlemen, Rohan Murty.
So, as Daniel mentioned, it's not my full-time job, but something on the side. About 10 years ago, I started a not-for-profit. And what we do is we find pieces of literature that's plays, poetry, prose, across different Indian languages. So, it can be Sanskrit, it can be my mother tongue Kannada, but the old form, which is Hale Kannada, or it can be old Tamil, medieval Marathi, etc., etc., etc. And so about 14 of these classical forms, and we translate them to English, with the hope and intention of keeping these books alive and having these books more widely. Our aim is to do this for the next 100 years, and every year in January, we release between 3 to 5 new volumes of these books. You can look this up online. You can find us on Flipkart and Amazon. We're called MCLI, or the Murty Classical Library of India. So examples of the kinds of books that we have translated and published are, for example, the Therigatha. The Therigatha is one of the oldest pieces of poetry written by women that is still accessible to mankind. It's written in Pali, in Burmese script. So it was written by the first set of women who became Buddhist nuns. It's roughly 2,000 years old. Similarly, you know, we have this year rather I should say in 2019, last year, one of the books we published was Risalo, which is a cornerstone of Sindhi poetry. We've published 2 years prior, we published the great Kannada medieval poet Raghavanka's poem of King Harishchandra. And so when you see these books, when you open these books, on the left-hand side you will see the original script, and then on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side you will see the translation. Now these translations are typically done by scholars of well-known repute, of course from within India and from across the globe, so they aren't necessarily done by people like myself who are consumers of these books, but not really scholars of these languages. And so far we have about 22 to about 25 volumes published, and every year we publish between 3 to 5 new volumes. So our hope is in 100 years we would have published, with best effort, about 500 such books. And we have scholars from about 36 different countries that cooperate with us and help us do these translations. I've met some extraordinary scholars across the globe who have deep interest in Indian texts and Indian languages as a result of this effort. For example, a very well-known and well-respected scholar of Telugu literature and Malayalam literature, turns out, is an extraordinary scholar at Hebrew University named David Schulman. I did not really know earlier that there would be such interest for someone living in Israel to actually want to know Malayalam and Telugu as well. And he spent his whole lifetime studying it. Similarly, we have some extraordinary scholars in Karnataka who are helping us, some scholars in Tamil Nadu. We have scholars I recently was in London where I met a man named Christopher Shackle, who's a professor who for 50 odd years has studied Punjabi and is an expert on Punjabi. And so like this, we are bringing together a community of like-minded people who are in love with Indian literature, who want to bring Indian literature to the mainstream. And the reason why this is important, really, if I have to sort of personalize it to many people here or to their children, I grew up in Bangalore until the end of my 12th standard. I finished my education in Bangalore. I went to an ICSE syllabus school, an English medium school. And so when I was in school, we read Hamlet, for 2 years. We read Merchant of Venice for 2 years. We read Charles Dickens for 2 years. We read Wordsworth. We even read Walt Whitman's "Oh Captain, My Captain, Our Fearful Trip is Done." I remember when we read Walt Whitman's poem about the end of the American Civil War. Well, at least in the last 100 odd years, we have not really had that kind of a civil war in India. So many of us in school didn't really know what a civil war was. And frankly, most people, unless they had read or heard about it at home from their parents or friends, didn't really know who Abraham Lincoln was or what the Civil War was about. And yet, despite all of that, we read these poems, as they say, we mugged these poems, we took exams on these poems, we answered questions on these poems, and we got marks, based on our familiarity with these poems.
Rohan, it's important. How many of you still had to mug these poems till last year? Okay, one hand. How many of you had to mug these poems in 12th standard? 12th standard? 10th standard? How many of you like doing that? Fantastic.
No, I would say it was not that it was not an enjoyable experience reading about these things. I'm just setting the context as to, why we produce these books. We also, actually more than Walt Whitman, we read James Joyce's Ulysses, which is talking about slaughter of limbs and Priam, and of course it had these beautiful lines, to strive, to seek, to find, never to yield. And this was about a stage and setting and a context and culture that was extremely foreign to any of us. We didn't understand any of this. In fact, my school teacher taught us that it's not Ithaca, it is Ithaka. For a long time I used to think it was Ithaka. And so really my point is that it's part of, and I'm not alone in this. I think anyone who goes to an English medium school in a city, particularly studies a national syllabus like the ICSE syllabus, experiences this. And yet, while we read all of this literature, we never read any Kannada, Sanskrit, Telugu, Tamil, Bengali, etc., literature of any kind in our school. So by the time I finished my 12th standard, if you asked any one of us from my school, can you name 10 great authors from India in the last 1,000 years, we'd probably have a hard time, unless you learnt about it at home, which some of us were fortunate to do so. And so really, the question I've always wondered and attempted to understand for myself is, why is it, we can always claim colonial and post-colonial and so on and so forth, but this is 70 years after independence, and yet we still seem to be in a situation where at least in my opinion, we don't educate our youth well enough. We don't have sufficient balance in what we teach. And so that's how I became very interested in this whole area. And so in some small way, the effort that we do in publishing these translations is to contribute towards, correcting this imbalance. But even then, we are a small effort because we only produce 5 books a year, 5 volumes a year. And in 100 years, it'll only be 500 volumes. If you think of how many, old Tamil literature books, pieces of literature, prose and poetry you have access to, it's probably millions, right? So there has to be a much larger movement and an effort to bring about more awareness, and I think we're playing a small part in this whole thing. So that is really the context as to why I'm here and what I'm very passionate about when I'm not doing my work.
Fantastic. Rohan, you talked about how English language learning is something that I think almost everybody here in this room has grown up with, and how the classics and you said some of the things which needed to even be given context were things that we learned. However, when it comes to Indian language and Indian text, and we have such a plethora of languages around, why do you think that it's never ever made its way into the mainstream curriculum, either in a translated form or even in its native form?
Yeah, I'm not an expert or an academic of these matters. I'm a computer scientist. so I can only answer as a consumer, which I suspect most people in this room are, a consumer of these kinds of, books. As a consumer, my perspective is that somehow I actually think it really ought to start from school syllabi. I think, we also learned quite foolish ideas in school, in our history lessons even. Things like Indians never really traveled abroad because you would feel you would lose your religion. I mean, complete nonsense. That's not true. We know that for a fact, right? So, I mean, and for me, I always felt I was very lucky. My mother's a writer, so I learned a lot from my mother. But what I learned in school was completely inadequate. And I think the most disservice you can do to any young people in any country is to not teach them, the good, bad, and the ugly of their own culture, their own civilizational pride or mistakes and so on. And
I think that deserves a round of applause.
Which at least for us, at least I felt we never learned these things. So to me, it's a very systemic issue. But that's one part, right? There's the second part too, where I often try to draw inspiration from what the Japanese do. So my cousins are half Indian and half Japanese, and they speak Japanese very fluently, and I see that a lot of how they learned their mother tongue and their culture on that side of the family it was all sort of processed and into a form like either through comics and manga and various things like this. So from very young age, the system was set up such that children found it very appealing. And so maybe there are methods like this that are possible. But I'll say this. So every year, I give about 10 keynotes on this topic at various lit fests. And usually people say, oh, the books you produce, for example, are very interesting, but can we have simplified versions of these books? And actually, I disagree with those thoughts, because the same parents who ask me this question are okay when their children have to read Hamlet in its full gory form, which is frankly not very pleasant in my opinion. At least in our school, we never read an abridged version of Hamlet. We accept that. So why would you want an abridged version of Kalidasa? I don't understand, right? And so
maybe because they can't read it.
Maybe, but somehow we need some sort of an education of the value and importance of what has been produced in this part of the world some time ago. I'm not talking of fiction like this rockets in the Vedas. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying of things that we truly can be proud of.
I can count at least 5 ministers who would disagree with you.
That's okay. I mean, I have facts on my side, so that's all that counts. India is an incredibly rich place that, I think Rabindranath Tagore has this beautiful quote, India is one place where you don't need to invent history, you have to just read it. And you have such an extraordinary culture and history and language. You want to talk about science. I know this session is supposed to be about science. I mean, there are deep connections. So one of my best friends, Manjul Bhargava, who's the Fields Medalist mathematician, he and I are actually working on some of these ideas together, and we discuss this often. There are deep connections between Sanskrit poetry and mathematics, which have been known forever, which is quite rare, which most civilizations do not produce. So why would you not teach your young people these kinds of things as well? So they can also have a sense of, hey, my culture isn't only about snake charmers, basmati rice, and poverty, or whatever it is that people sort of have an external image of. That there are some legitimate things that we also can be quite.
No, I think we should put that to the test, and this is something we spoke about. Okay, maths and science students, at some point of time, maths, science, engineering. Okay, where did Fibonacci come from? Just shout out. Don't look for a mic. Sorry? Okay. Fibonacci. Did somebody say Darwin? That's disturbing. Okay.
Yeah, I actually, since there are math students, I'll just like to narrate what I learned last evening. I was at the Infosys Science Prize. Amartya Sen was the chief guest, and he gave a wonderful example of how knowledge is produced between civilizations, and it flows between civilizations. And it is a necessary thing for knowledge to flow between civilizations. So it goes to sine, as in trigonometry, sine and cosine. When Aryabhatta finished one of his treatises in roughly 499 AD, this is as told by Amartya. So he coined the term ardhajiya. I'm not a Sanskrit expert. I'm a consumer, and which translates to half chord. And when this knowledge of Aryabhatta's discovery reached Arabic mathematicians. So they said, okay, we'll transliterate Jia to Jiba, because Jiba is an Arabic word. And then they played around with the consonants using, the same consonants. So on. They made Jiba, it went to Jiab to then Jiba. And so then finally in roughly 12th century, when that information went from Arab mathematicians to Europe, this Italian mathematician translated it. And by the way, Jiba means bay or cove. So he then translated bay or cove to Latin, which is sinus, and then you have sine. So what is extraordinary is over long periods of time, you see information produced in one civilization, knowledge produced in one civilization, changed or enhanced by another and spread to another and spread to another. And so there's this extraordinary cooperation of civilizations coming together to produce knowledge that we all use everywhere today. And I did not know of this story of, the birth and voyage of sine.
I really don't think that too many people knew that sine was sine. How many people actually knew the story? Anybody? Did anybody know the story? Okay, you did, because you were talking to Rohan. I saw you before this. Okay. Okay, Rohan, I must ask this because, we are in Tamil Nadu, and language is a very contentious issue in Tamil Nadu. We're very proud of Tamil as a language, and, there's been a lot of debate about, retaining the mother language and the literature and the form that it's in and all of that. When you have states that have more than one native Indian language, how then can you tend to preserve the science that once existed in a contemporary setting?
Okay, I take your question to be, how do you preserve your mother tongue?
And the science behind it, because you were talking about how the science is long lost and people don't even know the origins anymore in a lot of ways.
No,
at least not in
necessarily,
contemporary
not yet.
Okay.
But Daniel, there's a broader pattern to what you're saying, right? I don't want to take Tamil as an example because I know Kannada better. My mother tongue is Kannada. I'll answer with Kannada.
All right.
Right? So I grew up in a household where my mother writes in Kannada and English, so she made sure I can read and write Kannada quite well, which I can, but I know contemporary Kannada. In the last couple of years, my mother has been learning Hale Kannada through old Kannada, right, which is 1,000+ years old. Been taking classes to learn, and so we've been trying to read together. I can't read it, okay, and I'm quite the typical, in that sense, South Indian, glasses, computer scientist. I fit that bill, and therefore I'm not alone in this. And so now the real question is, in my generation, in the successive generations, where do you find the next set of people or readers or people who can appreciate old Kannada? And you can replace old Kannada with old any other Indian language, you'll have the same issues. And so the real the challenge before us, I actually think we're already in the midst of a loss of culture. When there's a tsunami, the way the physics of it works, that the wave really builds up. And so if you're in the crest of the wave, you don't notice the speed of the wave as much as if you're on shore, because you actually see it coming. And I think we're in the crest of a wave of a tsunami of cultural loss in almost every language in India. And either we realize it, but we're okay with it, or we don't realize it. Because it is, in my entire friend circle, in Bangalore, there are people who can read and write Kannada quite well, contemporary Kannada, but Hale Kannada is almost not there at all. And and this is stuff that's accumulated over, hundreds of years, and by, there's extraordinary literature produced. Now you take Tamil, old Tamil, same story. Now, some people may say in some states they do a slightly better job than other states, maybe, but I think, we have a much...
it's more or less sort of along the same patterns is what you're saying.
It is. I mean, and that to me is truly worrying, because, over the last couple of years, last 10 years, I've spent time traveling to about, roughly, I would say 18 states, and going to several colleges, because I've been very interested in regional languages as a part-time sort of hobby thing for myself, to understand what do people study in schools, in colleges, what is the syllabus, particularly from the perspective of languages. And it's the same story I find everywhere. And what do people speak at home? Can they speak classical forms? It's only contemporary forms, and so on. And so I think we're in the, and we're not producing scholars anymore, or we rarely produce scholars to to sustain these old languages or
They
the
are
older forms of
producing
these
scholars. What quality they are is...
No, there are exceptions too. I mean, there are some people who have extraordinary love and passion, and not to take away anything from them, but it's certainly not the norm, or it may have never been the norm, but the numbers and the magnitude are so much lower. Most of us, at least in the South, tend to become engineers, doctors, lawyers, or whatever else, right?
Yeah.
And without knowing these old forms. So that to me is the thing that I would worry most about, and I think there's no one government or no policy alone that can change these things. All of those things are helpful, but it requires a wider appreciation, knowledge from people, from society, and civilizational pride, perhaps, saying, okay, maybe we all need to make an effort. We need to teach our children, we need to teach our friends, and somehow we need to keep these things alive. I don't know how else you save these things.
I think we'll figure it out. I think we have time for one question because we're so late on time. One question.
There's someone in the middle.
The lights are so bad I can't even see.
Yeah, we can't see.
Okay, right. Could somebody get her a mic, please? Right in the middle. Ma'am, please introduce yourself and get straight to the question. We'll reserve the statements for a little later.
The mics. I'm Pratibha, and I'm from Madurai, Lady Do College. And I have a question the question that I have is, what is your opinion on the pseudoscience peddled by famous people right now in India? And how do you think we can counter it? Because I'm from the mathematics department, and anytime I see people peddling the pseudoscience, talking about physics, energy, E equal to mc squared, and everything.
We have plenty of that. Don't worry about it.
So,
It's all over the place. I mean, we love
Right.
it. Social media loves it. Ron, you want to take that?
No, I mean,
I'm sure you don't, but you have to answer it.
But Professor, maybe you have a better sense of this, but I just ignore it because I don't think this is still mainstream enough in India that you should have to worry about it. There are always crackpots in every society who believe strange things. That's okay. They can. As long as you're a professor and you're teaching people that there's a relationship between Einstein's notion of energy and mass, I think that's all that counts. So I would never really worry about somebody making strange claims. That's okay.